Hello, everyone. Welcome to Justice with Jax. We're in season 2. This is episode 6, and we have a great guest for you today. And so today is Tuesday, November 19, 2024. It's been 1 year, 3 months, 19 days, or 477 days since the case Armendariz versus the city of Colorado Springs
Hello,
has been
everyone.
filed. And I have my guest today, Jason. Woohoo! I'm going to let him introduce himself in a second. and I guess here's where, Jason, I usually give a quick case update because as we were discussing with cases that are in U.S. District Court, I use the word languish. And sometimes we can feel like justice delayed is justice denied. We've heard of that one. So on our end, myself and my co-plaintiff, Chinook Center, are being very patient with the process because where we are now is we continue to be in U.S. District Court, the 10th Circuit. And so the defendants, that is the city of Colorado Springs and the U.S. government or the FBI, were granted another extension to file their reply brief to what the ACLU of Colorado wrote. And so, as the holidays approach, it's likely the next action in the case will be ACLU Colorado's response to the city and the U.S. government. And that may happen sometime in January 2025. And so, as a reminder, we are bringing this case to protect our rights to free speech, our rights to privacy. And so where we are at now is the court, the U.S. District Court, the circuit, is looking at the kind of application of the law and the arguments around that and kind of reviewing the lower court's ruling that happened earlier this year in April, which was they granted a motion to dismiss, which is why we are in appeals. And so the next big milestone will be potentially oral arguments sometime in 2025. And then when it comes to litigation in Colorado Springs, people working to protect our rights and stand up for themselves, I really want to take a moment to note that today is 2 years since the mass shooting at Club Q here in Colorado Springs. And it just so happens that the families, some of the victims, survivors, and the mothers, as of Sunday, so just a few days ago, filed 2 lawsuits claiming negligence. And so they claimed that the club provided lax security, and their claim also states that the sheriff's office failed to trigger the state's red flag law to ensure that the shooter could not purchase any more weapons, according to a report from The Guardian this past Monday. And so, as we recall today, 5 people 2 years ago were taken from us, and these victims, these survivors, these mothers, these families are standing up for our community and our loved ones. And I wanted to make it a point to recognize that on Justice with Jax and just put out that they are welcome to come into this space anytime if they wish to talk more about their stories as well, because that's a story that will need to be told in perpetuity. Finally, I just want to share the names of the 5 folks who were taken away from us today 2 years ago. That's Raymond Green Vance, Kelly Loving, Daniel Aston, Derek Rump, and Ashley Pop. And we thank their families and our community for continuing to stand up. And I know that's a really somber note. And the reason we have to bring that up is because there's a lot of intersection in our world. And so those survivors, those families are now in the legal system, which is the main thing we talk about this show. And I'm going to pass it over to Jason to introduce himself a bit more because we're transitioning into where the legal system intersects with law and why politics and elections and all of those ins and outs really matter. So, Jason, would you mind introducing yourself?
Jason Warf, he, him. Jackie and Jax and I go back a long way. I'm the executive director of the Southern Colorado Cannabis Council. We've been around, I think we'll get into in a minute, for forever. We've been around since regulation started in Colorado. My work primarily is at the Capitol. I do some local work with cities and counties. I do a lot of consulting out of state at this point, so it keeps me hopping. I've always had a focus on social justice. So the drug war is arguably one of the biggest social justice issues out there, and that's you can totally prod me for more info there on the organization, but that's essentially who I am.
Thanks, Jason. And I think one of the key things to say or give context for folks when they're thinking about really the cannabis industry is there are, I would say, different lanes, right? There's a corporate cannabis industry. There's more of the independent, you would call, yes, like small business, really medical and patient oriented. Obviously, we understand, frankly, the profits lie in recreational cannabis. So, can you give a little bit of context about how the organization, which I proudly volunteered with for a time, and that's how Jason and I know each other, because to his point, if you want to talk social justice, there's many different layers to it. The quote unquote war on drugs is certainly one piece of it. And so, can you give folks an idea of what that landscape looks like? I guess let's stick to Colorado for now.
Well, of course, and just to give a brief overview of the organization itself, the Southern Colorado Cannabis Council, we started life as the Colorado Springs Medical Cannabis Council, and we started in 2009. At the time, there was no regulation, of course, and we came together as a group of owners, advocates, attorneys, with the idea that the state was going to regulate at some point. But prior to that, we really wanted to bring sort of a code of ethics to the industry. Yeah, a lot of folks don't realize that we had hundreds of stores throughout the state for a few years before we actually regulated. So
Right. And there were
that being
clubs,
said,
which was a whole other animal, right?
yeah, well, that more adult use. I'm going way back to prior to medical. You know,
Mm,
our organization actually brought regulation to Colorado in that we were asked by the city of Colorado Springs to help them look at regulating medical at the time. And probably a few months after we started the process with the city, the state finally decided after 10 years they were going to regulate medical. So we sort of put the city stuff on hold and transitioned over to the state level. Without spending the whole hour or time slot going through our history, essentially we've been involved in everything cannabis in Colorado since 2009. We're gearing up for another year at the Capitol. Me personally, this will be my 16th session there, which is kind of
wow.
unbelievable, but here we are. So yeah, as Jax, as you mentioned, and I was trying to think earlier what year that was. You did some work with us up in Denver, I think.
Like
20.
2017.
Yeah, that's I was close.
Mm-hmm.
I remembered you were there right around the time we were working on the club stuff. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's a great way to illustrate that this subject has a long history. And so I I wanted to bring some value, I hope, to, the local discourse, political discourse by focusing on Question 300. That's a big part of what happened locally for Colorado Springs. And the segue here, as I mentioned, all politics is local, and politics, whether you want to believe it or not, affects the daily ins and outs of your life, right? And so that's why, it felt especially important to bring up that the folks who experienced Club Q directly as survivors and the victim's family and even our community at large, like politics affected their lives in that moment. And so, again, just the utmost respect and care to them as they now litigate their own case, which I have a lot of empathy for. And so that's why I wanted to get into the meat of politics, as frankly, as unappealing as that can be, right, sometimes, Jason. But between you and I, like, we are definitely political watchers. And so in talking about ballot question 300, there was a companion, so to speak, that you could call ballot issue 2D, right? Which 2D was the ban on rec, and question 300 was the legalization. And so right now, it is pretty amazing that Colorado Springs, the red dot that it's known to be, has now actually legalized recreational cannabis. And what we saw play out during this last election is really we thought they were going to cancel each other out, it looked like. And then 300 pulled ahead. So, Jason, what do you kind of make of that trend? And what do you see, from here on out, especially with regard to the fact that you know, a question like 300 has probably appeared on the ballots of Colorado Springs voters for at least 3 times in the last 5 years. Is that right? So, can you paint a picture for people, Jason?
Sure, it's been a long, arduous journey for the proponents. To be fair, our organization has not spearheaded any of the three efforts, but we've been supportive. We're very aware, I guess, that as you sort of alluded to, the Colorado Springs is a lot different than other areas in the state. Obviously, a lot more conservative, and I think part of the challenge over the years was even the industry itself was a little split on whether they wanted to see
Mhm.
adult use. So, kudos to the campaign for sticking with it. I think I'm trying to cover your questions here. I think that, with the passage, there are a lot of challenges that I'll dive into. If we'll go down that rabbit hole a little
As
bit.
much as we can. Yeah.
Right, right. If you've probably seen me on local media or our president. We've interviewed a couple times, and
Mhm.
we've come across as maybe a little critical of the effort. And honestly, that isn't really the intent. But what we've found ourselves in a really weird situation there, because we have an ordinance currently that City Council passed.
The fly in the ointment. Yes.
Yes. So the way that that's going to play out is going to be extremely interesting, and possibly may have to go through the courts. Uh,
Mhm.
the reality is they've expanded the buffer zone, meaning,
It was a zoning ordinance, essentially. Is that right?
right. So the federal, to go back to 2000, oh gosh, the Cole memo, 2010, I believe.
Hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
we as a state went to the feds and asked for guidance. One of the things that they suggested is keep it 1,000 foot from schools and daycares. And some folks had to relocate, but we swallowed that pill and we did it. So City Council has passed an ordinance that has expanded that to a mile buffer. And the issue with that is there's really nowhere in the Springs that fits that criteria.
Exactly. Nowhere in the city limits that basically they zoned these shops out of existence.
Right. The other challenge, I think, is, and I've interpreted this the way that I've read it. So, maybe there was a hopefulness. But the way that it's written and the way that I read the ordinance, it doesn't allow folks to open new stores. Essentially, they would have had to have applied for a license at their existing locations. I There's a possibility I'm wrong in my interpretation there. Let me premise
And
that.
this is 300 specifically.
Correct. Yes.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
if that's the case, that's kind of a double whammy because, there is
Hmm.
a small area, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's out off of Powers that would allow, would appease the mile buffer zone, right? The challenge is that if no one can move their location, it's just a non-starter, right?
It's a moot point. Sure, certainly. Hmm.
Right. So, I think that I'm not trying to be a pessimist here, but I think that there's still an uphill battle despite the fact that the voters spoke. And let's be honest, for the Springs, it was a fairly good margin that they won by.
Right.
So I think it's part of it has to be in the hands of the community. As an organization, we've worked with, obviously, as I mentioned prior, we've worked with the Springs since they started looking at any regulation. We have that experience as an organization. We've been very successful down there in things we've worked with them on. Um, and we just felt that there were some very basic things that weren't done right. And one of the biggest, and I think I was even quoted in the Gazette or somewhere on this. One of the biggest things that I think was a failure is if we would have ran this campaign, the very first thing we would have done was went to city council and said, "Hey guys, we're going to run this initiative. Are you good with that? Are you going to try to counter it?" Because knowing how the Spring City Council has worked forever, I think they just should have known that something like this was going to come down the pipe. It's unfortunate, but again, we've seen it time and time again on the more so on the medical side, obviously, where council has completely went against the will of the population.
Mhm.
So again, my point
It's a
there.
bit messy now, is kind of what we're getting at.
Messy's a really good word. Um,
Diplomatic way of putting it.
yeah, very much so. And again, I don't want to disparage their efforts. It's been a long course.
Congratulations on the victory, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
certainly.
exactly. And the only point is, I think aside from any avenues they can pursue through, either lobbying or the courts, I think the community has to step up. They have to get in the ears of city council and say, look, guys, like we voted this in. They need to be showing up to the council meetings and, commenting on this. So,
That's good advice for here on out. Something we regularly bring up on the show is calls to action. What are you going to keep on doing? How are you going to be the change that you want to see in the world? And so I think that's well said. And can I ask, I guess there are 2 points that come to mind. One, I did end up voting for 300, but I also had some reservations. And, correct me if I'm wrong. And we can certainly, I usually put links to fact check ourselves on the show in the description. But is it right too that I understood you would basically need to already be operating medical to be eligible to apply for rec? And that seems short-sighted to me because obviously the I am a medical patient, right? And so I'm really wondering what this is going to look like. And that seemed to me, for lack of a better word, short-sighted simply because the share of the market of medical is going to be significantly smaller than what the share of a recreational cannabis market in the second largest city in Colorado is going to be. And so, can you talk a little bit about those noticings?
sure. Well, I would expand on what your concern is. The simple answer is yes. You had to be, as of election day, you have to be a licensed operator to be able to transition. The bigger concern for us is, for a number of years at the Capitol, we've worked on social equity issues. Last year we were able to throw an amendment into a bill to help social equity applicants or licensees. There, and just from that perspective, the reality is the folks that have been in the market in both markets forever are not people, black and brown folks. It's mostly white folks.
It's
We just
the
have to be
people who started with capital, right?
exactly, or weren't kept out because of a felony for growing cannabis or
Mm-hmm.
selling, whatever. So that said, I think the climate has shifted to it's time to allow more of an equitable share. Uh, that's not going to happen under this initiative, unfortunately, because it is only existing owners. So anyone looking to be able to jump in on the rec side in the Springs, it's you're not allowed
Is
to.
shut out.
Right. So we've again
Solid
put up a
point.
barrier
Yeah.
to that, and just
Mm-hmm.
on a moral standpoint, our organization, we don't tout it a lot, but we were founded and essentially we're still the majority run by women and non-white folks. I'm just the old white guy who knows how to talk well, I guess,
It
sometimes.
kind of works for a citizen lobbyist at the Capitol, let's be honest. Maybe here and there.
I fit some stereotypes there for sure. But I personally speaking, I know my story. I come into this as a patient myself. So for me, I just kind of woke up one day and said, why is this still illegal? And it's,
Yeah.
a long history. As I did an event in DC before moving out here, and I was just like, why aren't we doing more? Why are people still going to jail? But anyway, so the point was our organization from day one is not even not to give special treatment to anyone, but to make sure everyone has a fair shake, right? And it's just
Right.
to not allow new entry. It's a huge hang up for us, if I'm being quite
I
honest.
agree. Yeah, and that's why I hesitated ultimately on how my vote would go. And as I mentioned, I did decide yes, but that was one of the biggest factors of disappointment for me. And well said, Jason. And another, another piece of it that would love your insight on is oftentimes I would say with these types of efforts, you might even call it a double-edged sword because I don't recall for this particular question, but times we had tried to pass it before, sometimes the revenues are going to then go to areas where maybe some of us as taxpayers don't think the cannabis tax revenues should be going, like, frankly, to the police and getting them militarized, right? Like, I don't believe that, where I come from in Texas, there was a school district police force that had like a US Army tank as part of their equipment. I don't believe that that is the way we should be utilizing our public funding. And so there can be much more discourse about that, how we use public funding, of course. But what can you tell us about ballot question 300, which is, now passed? Because a lot of times it gets a little bit frustrating. I hear people talk about cannabis tax revenues, and some people like, oh, where's all the money going? And it's like, well, honestly, if I look at Manitou Springs, I see it going to their infrastructure. I think that city is a great example of what recreational cannabis tax revenue can bring. Now, I think it's harder, or at least muddier, cloudier for people to understand where the tax revenues are going to, for instance, at the state level, because there's a number of entities that get their slice of the pie when we're taxing this industry, right? So, can you dive in a little bit on that?
Yeah, I just have to joke a little that the state level funding is a mess. It's going to all kinds of things that it was not intended to go to. I'll be the first, as a lobbyist up there, I'll be the first to admit that.
Gotcha.
I will bounce back from my we'll call it light criticism. I think they actually did a good thing here. I would agree with you on the public safety programs. I think that's kind of nonsense. We know that cannabis doesn't increase anything. We've had 20 plus years to look at that. There's no reason to further fund police. But I do think the guidance they gave with the mental health services, the
Okay.
PTSD services,
Mhm.
and programs for vets, be in the springs, that
Mhm.
wasn't set in stone. I think it would have played out through the council exactly what they wanted to do. But I do
Mhm.
think in the initiative that, the fact that they mention those things is a good thing. It's a push
A
in the right
positive.
direction, right?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because frankly, I hadn't I was referring to the experts. How about that? In kind of what was in there because it is a lot of like legalese, right? It's city ordinance jargon, so it can there's no shame in feeling like this is confusing, right? And this is something I feel like people experience every election cycle, the pressure of just, trying to do the research, trying to do the right thing. And I would point to question 300 as a bright spot in what was a really tough election cycle, you know? And so to put it lightly, which we can certainly dive in and touch on that a bit more, but um, I really appreciate too, as you named that when it comes to this town and veterans, that's an obvious connection. And I would just name that through the incredible bonds you build and relationships through activism and advocacy, I have met more than one veteran who has told me their story that frankly, through service, they got pumped up with opioids and it really caused a dark time in their life. And then they were able to find, freedom here in Colorado to consume cannabis, largely as medical patients, obviously, here in Colorado Springs, and how that turned their life around. And so I think that is. We need to recognize the wins and the good things where they are, which is part of the mission of this show for sure.
Well, absolutely. And I think you hit on a point that maybe we forgot to talk about or should talk about is the confusion, right? Even the two competing ballot initiatives, some would
Right.
argue that was done to confuse voters. And in a perfect world, that wouldn't happen. Either people vote for it or they vote against it. One initiative, the competing language was very misleading. I
The
got
ban. Yeah.
yeah, I had a bit of an in-depth, off-the-record discussion with a reporter I talked to, and the way that I framed it is, the results speak for themselves, but do they? Right? Because you can look at it both ways. Either people were misled, so they voted for 2D, or there's half the population that voted for cannabis and half that voted for 2D because they didn't want it. So it's,
Mhm.
who knows? We'll never know. But it should have never been on the ballot, is my point there. It's let's put one question forward, and if a community says yes, they say yes. If they say no, we move on.
That's a great point because I would name that I kind of suspected or anticipated that we might have egg on our face again because it looks kind of silly to have the two cancel each other out, and I thought that's where we were headed based on the immediate results, because actually that had happened here before, right, Jason? Do you remember where it must have been maybe 2 years, I don't even think four, where essentially we voted yes on taxing recreational cannabis, but we voted no on allowing recreational cannabis, and we looked silly. It looked silly because, to your point, it was a pretty clear indication, in my view, that people just didn't understand what they were voting on in that case. Because if you voted yes on one and no on the other, you're just canceling out your votes, right? And that's kind of what we saw the previous cycle. So thankfully, I would say we've made some progress with the passage of question 300 at least.
Well, and not only that, but I think the city has to mature on this issue. Uh, they're overdue on maturing on this issue. The
Well
reality
said. Yeah.
is folks, the only thing the city's doing is losing tax money. Folks are
Thank
just
you.
driving to Manitou, they're driving to Pueblo, they're driving to Denver, um, when
Let's name it.
when they could just go
Yeah.
down the street and spend the money locally, and it's just silly. Colorado Springs has always had this attitude like, oh, we're Olympic City, we're Christian City, we're going to keep it out because it's
Right.
the devil's lettuce, quote unquote.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Michael Phelps smokes weed, so if anything,
Right,
cannabis makes you a champion.
right. And there's a whole
That's what I
other
think.
discussion, about recovery for athletes and all that.
Hmm.
And it's just absurd at this point, if we're being honest. The city, I think, is just embarrassing themselves.
Right.
I don't think it's obviously the polls showed this year. It's not what the majority want there, and it's really just time for them to, pardon my language, but grow up and do what's right.
I would say the same. I think I've probably gone to public comment and been saltier with them, so not a problem, Jason. Um, but
I
I think
probably
where
have.
we can, yeah, I bet, yeah. And so I think maybe what I would love to hear from you on too then is, you know, do you anticipate what kind of changes in the landscape might there be? I know that's a bit challenging. Like, you don't necessarily have a crystal ball, but how about this? For instance, we're looking at it possibly playing out in the courts because of that fly in the ointment that we named, which is that zoning ordinance essentially. So I wouldn't set the expectation with anyone that's like, guess what? January 1, 2025 in Colorado Springs, you're going to be able to walk into a recreational cannabis dispensary. That is not, I think, in our future. So what can you share from your perspective as a deeply embedded, organization?
Sure. You lay out a good foundation because I do think it's going to be sort of in the city's hands to step up and work with the industry to do the responsible thing, right? And if they don't, unfortunately, it's not gonna transpire, and we're gonna have a battle through the courts more than likely. And again, that's not what the citizens asked for. So let's be hopeful that council does that, city council does that, and I think there'll be a rulemaking process, and of course, an effective date. And if it plays out the way that it should, we should expect to see more tax revenue coming into the city. Folks may expand their grows and that type of thing to meet the demand. And, that's something I don't think that gets enough credit is the ancillary effect of the industry. So
Oh
Colorado
yeah,
Springs, it's a fairly booming metropolis, if you will, for
it's
Colorado.
definitely growing,
Yeah, yeah.
and our
I'm a
county's
city guy,
huge.
so I grew up south of Chicago. So when I think cities, I don't ever think of Colorado per se, but for our state,
Right.
it's growing, and that would just aid that. The ancillary effects of you know electricians and everything that you need to build something out. Attorneys, that type of thing. I mean, there's a number of businesses that benefit from the industry. It's not just the
Certainly.
tax revenue. And then, as I mentioned before, the programs that they're pushing them towards, that's a great benefit to the city. I mean, just quickly to hit on one, any program that benefits the veteran population in the Springs, I know my organization would see it as a winner. I would also just state here, as I've stated other places, like our organization is here to help, whether that's city council reaching out to us or folks in the industry. As you talked about, we have that experience. We started it there, so we're here. We we're here to help in whatever way we can. So
Well said. And that's something I've always appreciated and what attracted me to, lending my time and energy to supporting the Southern Colorado Cannabis Council because we know there's a lot of money to be made in the cannabis industry, and it was evident to me early on that the organization was representing really the patience and kind of the David versus Goliath voices and interests that can play out with these types of power dynamics when money and policy making is involved, right? And so I'm so grateful for that work. And, keep in mind, this is a nonprofit, so nonprofits take donations. See, you didn't even have to plug it, Jason. I will.
we do. Yeah, folks can visit our website and make donations. You can become a member, become active in our process. Um, we always welcome volunteers. As you mentioned, that's how you and I met. You
Right. This
volunteered
will
a
be
while back.
a continuing issue. Oh, sorry, we cut out there. Can you repeat that, Jason?
You're good. I just was finishing. I said, as you mentioned, that's how you and I met, as you volunteered with us for a year or so. So anyone who
Yeah.
wants to come to the Capitol and learn policy and has some time to kill, we're here. Get a hold of us.
It was a phenomenal way to learn the capital as a new to Colorado person, and so would highly encourage folks who have a passion for the subject matter to connect with the organization. Absolutely, and that I did want to ask this question, which reminds me, because that's how we met, having a passion for being advocates, activism, and so flash forward, we have kept in touch. And can you recall, it's been so interesting to me. I feel very rich, grateful for my circles of people. And I've been asking when my folks come on the show is like, do you remember the moment or what you thought when you heard about me being represented by ACLU of Colorado? Because it's been very insightful, and the point of this show is to lift up other voices as well and really portray, this case has Chinook Center, my name on it, but it is, and I'm going to say it probably every show, it is about so much more than us. It's about this community. And so I'm loving hearing everyone's perspectives on this moment that they happen to know me, and it's like, what, it might have seemed random. Jason, do you remember?
Well, yeah, no, it's a great question. You know, don't take this as it's coming from for me, but there were levels of a sense of pride for you. Does that make sense?
Appreciate that. It totally does.
You know, I remember a conversation, or probably multiple conversations, that you and I had um, about you kind of finding your niche, what
Mm-hmm.
in activism. And when this went down, it was again layers, because for you, I felt
Mm.
there she is. Like, look at Jax go. You know,
Thank
at
you.
the same
Yeah.
time, as we discussed a little before the show, you know, I have a long history of, back then we would say activism. Now I'm just a boring lobbyist. Um, with
You're a citizen lobbyist, which I think is,
well,
distinguished.
I'm registered, but I'm one of the good ones.
Oh, okay. Gotcha, gotcha,
Yeah, no, I now help with natural medicine and some other things,
gotcha.
and our organization's sort of doing both nowadays. Um,
Mm,
but you know, I remember my time with Occupy, my time before medical was legal, when we were helping with court cases, you know, and
right.
literally, the DAs tried to file harassment charges against me because, well, I was being me. So, you know, the point to that is not me. It's that the Colorado Springs environment has needed pushback for a very long time. You know, there's a long history, as you're probably far more aware. I think it was the early 2000s when there was an anti-war protest, and they went in and basically just started beating people. They're known for putting snipers on their roofs and pointing their guns at peaceful protesters. I mean, it
Yes,
goes
Pig.
on.
He's come up on this show.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah,
it's, again, kudos is an easy way to say that, because
I appreciate that.
it's a thing that they needed to, what's the right word, have forced upon them. Is, you know, they're not going to change willingly. So unless you
Yeah.
take a stand and force it down their throat, it won't happen. And that's just very pessimistic of me to say, but knowing the Springs for nearly 20 years now, it's just a different world. So do your thing.
Right. And thank you, Jason. And, day by day, we keep pushing. And to your point, this quote, and I'm so blanking on who it belongs to, but the quote is, I believe it's Frederick Douglass, is power concedes nothing without a demand. And so I feel like you said, we were talking about finding my niche, and with when this case happened, like the niche found me because I didn't pick any of this, but at the same time I feel I was the best equipped person to carry on this demand for accountability, and I would rather it be me than, the moms who I've heard from who were being harassed by CSPD because they chose to be active during Black Lives Matter summer and prior because they don't want their black sons to be murdered by police.
Right.
Um, and so knowing those stories where frankly they were told to me because of what my lived experience is, and those people don't even have the privilege of being able to share that story publicly because of the, let's say, the heat or damage it could do to their personal lives. So I would rather be me than them. I'm sorry, it has to be anyone. And to your point, a lot of the response I get, it's this, I really feel like it's really great to be reminded how much people care and are actually rooting for each other, because it feels like that feels tough these days, but a lot of times people's response is super affirmative and like, you go girl, but also, and then in the same second they're like, I'm really sorry that had to happen to you.
Of
Like, I
course.
would never wish, yeah, I would never wish that. And it's almost like they feel like a little bad about having said that. And for me, more than anything, I just deeply appreciate the recognition that this is a big fight and I'm not doing it just for myself. And
Well,
that's a big part of what
sorry.
keeps me going.
I would just add that, yes, I did kind of glaze over that. And I do that. That's a fault of mine. But in that
No
same
worries.
sense, knowing you as long as I have, maybe I didn't offer that up because I know how strong you are.
Precisely. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
appreciate that.
I've known you long enough. You're absolutely. I hate that anyone goes through anything horrible in our world. But I'm not a religious guy. But what's the saying about God only gives you as much as you can handle, right?
Totally. Right, right, right.
And there's also a fate component. I believe that. Um,
I don't believe in coincidences, so
I look,
yes.
just a funny anecdote which made me smile when you were going through that
Hmm.
is I didn't mean to come to Colorado and do everything I've done. I moved here to go
Mm.
hiking, literally. The council approached me. I did my thing in DC, and they're like, and at the time, nothing was happening. And a couple hours
Mm.
here and there, I was like, sure, and 400 or 500 bills later, here I am. So it's just
Impressive.
things are meant to be. You're where you need to be in that time,
Thank you.
right? So
I do believe that. Absolutely. We're definitely on the same page there. And so would this be a weird time to transition into things are meant to be, and right now people are feeling pretty spent over the last election cycle, I think largely. And I'm here to make space for the people who these results, and I think there are plenty of us, were wounding, and there is a lot to say, I think, about the election process and the hypocrisy of how, 4 years ago, Stop the Steal was a thing. Now suddenly that's disappeared because Donald Trump allegedly won the popular vote. And I did deliberately use the word allegedly.
they're all they're all fair now, right?
Right. All our elections are fair now. And so it has been a really tough time. We're in this like lame duck season. And so part of what I wanted to do and part of the mission of this show is trying to strike a balance. Okay, like what's good out there too? There's some bright spots. And because this was like our election analysis approach where we kind of centered question 300 because that's a pretty meaty topic in itself, I think. But I'd like to bounce it to you. I definitely have my notes, but are there any other things like what's good in your life, some calls to action for the council, or even anything you want to uplift from election 2024 that, unfortunately, because of the challenges, to be diplomatic, of what the election results were in some spaces, I think a lot of the good stuff is just like getting glazed over. And so I wanted to spend some time shouting out there were good things that happened too.
Sure.
And we recognize the bad. We're feeling it. We're going to process it. A lot of people say the only way is through. Fair enough. So let's not forget the good. So passing it to you, Jason, what would you mention? What would you file under good? Good in your life, good in general.
Well, in my personal life, I've taken a step back and found, and I think this goes to everyone, especially right now. Times are tough, right? Like you went through everything. We're all feeling it, no matter who you are. And I think his supporters will soon be feeling it with us, whether they realize it or not. But that said,
Precisely.
for me personally, I've moved to a small town. I focus on walking my dog, riding my bike, going hiking, um, when I'm not doing policy stuff. So I think just generally speaking, advice for everyone, you have to have that balance, right?
Balance
Because
is key.
I'm the type of person, I try to carry everything on my shoulders and it'll kill you. You can't do that.
Right.
It's gonna be, and I will get positive segue in there, but it's gonna be a rocky few years. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat that. Um,
Certainly not.
I think the positive is, or the strength and the positive is, we need to find our communities, our people. We need to stick together. We need to look out for one another. Enjoy your friends, your family, the people around you, right? Enjoy the day to
Yes.
day. Enjoy the simple things. Not to sound, you know, uh, program there.
It's It's a saying because it's true. Like, we all, I hope, can experience the richness of the healing that safe relationships, supportive relationships can bring us all, you know?
That's right. That's right. You know,
Absolutely.
and simple things, music, art, you know, things that really bring you joy. Increase that. Put more of it in your life. Me personally, I my music every day, my art whenever I can get it. I'm in a small town, so that's a little limited, but we're a pretty good art community. But anyway, cannabis wise, positive. You know, there will be at least a couple efforts at the Capitol this year to continue to try to streamline regulation, make it a little easier on the industries. Our organization really worked hard to try to bring everyone, meaning the lobby, together to work on them. It's been a little bumpy, but we're still hopeful that we can all work under one umbrella this year to push these things through. One thing that's maybe not positive, but I'm sorry, I should have mentioned it at some point. Folks should be aware there's going to be an effort to try to cap THC. Unfortunately, it's been being led by a Democrat out of Boulder, Rep. Amable,
Interesting.
and the Republican on the bill will be Senator Pelton, or she's a senator now, I'm sorry. Senators Amable and Pelton, Byron Pelton. There's two Peltons in our legislature. So you know, again, we'll undoubtedly be working together as an entire lobby to try to kill that effort. Aside from that, you know, just try to brighten the day of the folks around you. That's
Kindness is free. That's what I
that's right.
like to
Free hugs,
remind
free
people of.
smiles, all the above.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Thank you. And yep, that's precisely why we make space on this show because, as I envisioned trying to tell this story, I knew there would be like heavy subject matter because justice affects all aspects of our lives and there are systemic issues. And so, the balance here that I wanted to offer, because we were doing a little bit of election recap, is just touch on like our Colorado and even local victories. We had some Democrats defending like vital seats like District 12 for State Senator elect Mark Snyder and House District State Rep elect for HD 18 Amy Pascal. That was some important stuff. And then we had some other solid highlights, I would say, in Colorado when it comes to amendments, right? We had a yes on J, which repeals the ban on same sex marriage in our Colorado Constitution. And thankfully, Amendment 79, a constitutional right to abortion, we now have here in Colorado. And so I also noted Amendment H, which creates an independent judicial disciplinary board, which I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. Because if you listen to this show, Justice with Jax, we definitely want to pay attention to what the judicial system is doing. And interestingly, we even found this too, Jason. You may have noticed that Proposition KK passed, which it imposes a tax on the sale of firearms and ammunition, which I thought was fascinating because that is something where Colorado, we have a blue trifecta, but the issue of gun control and policymaking around guns and firearms still continues to be, let's say, a hot button. And as a town where today we are remembering the Club Q mass shooting, that subject of gun violence is going to forever be a critical issue that we are addressing more than just talking, addressing.
Right.
And I wanted to share too that at least this prediction I was happy about was that reproductive justice had some big wins across the country. Abortion rights ballot measures won in 7 out of 10 states, and that includes Colorado, which I just named. And then, Jason, I don't know if you saw these reports because we're political nerds. But for the first time ever, our U.S. Senate will have two black women elected to serve simultaneously. That's right, Lisa Blunt of Delaware and Angela also Brooks of Maryland. And so also we have Sarah McBride, who also from Delaware became the first openly transgender person to be elected to the U.S. House of Reps, right? So these are things that happen. They just happen. But again, they haven't been given a lot of air because we know that we're facing challenges ahead. And
Well,
then from
just real quick, I think you could add a state to the abortion tally. Florida, it passed, But
Mm,
the thing is they up the ante. You have to have a 60% passage for any initiative.
that's right. I remember hearing about this. And so was it an initiative in Florida? And so,
I believe it's an amendment. I think I misspoke.
okay,
Yeah,
in their constitution as well.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I
Thank
think they
you.
got 53 or 54%, falling short,
Mm-hmm.
of course, of the 60%.
The technicality of it all. Yeah,
But
but that's a good
the
point.
the positive there is Florida. Florida used to be blue. I lived in Florida for a long time.
Mm, mm-hmm,
It was
mm-hmm.
not to show my age, but when I lived there, it was a purple or blue state. The
Right.
last few cycles, obviously, it's went pretty hard red.
Yeah.
So I think that's a positive to see it there pass, you know, with over 50%. And just nationwide, I mean, we look at all the
Mm-hmm.
even midterm referendums on abortion. These red states,
Mm-hmm.
you messed with women. And I think
The
that they're,
people do not want this. Yeah.
yeah, no, I think they're learning that that's maybe a bad stance. So just
Right.
politically speaking, I think that the Republican Party, I think we're going to see more victories for reproductive rights and maybe less
Me too.
from them because they have to come to terms with the fact that these electorates don't want these restrictions. So
Right. I would love to see them face reality. I still question whether they can. But to your point, the numbers are such, and when are you finally going to listen to the electorate? And so I think a few other quick like tidbits highlights I would share is also when it comes to like the queer community, which I consider myself the part of as a pansexual, that Julie Johnson from my home state of Texas, she was elected to the 32nd congressional district, and she became the first openly LGBTQ person to represent Texas in Congress, and the first elected from anywhere in the South, which we know why that's a big deal, right? Because the way things shake out politically, it is that region of the country that is prolifically and horrendously in their state legislatures producing these bills that are just wrongfully targeting, LGBTQ and trans people in just such a inhumane way. Like the dehumanization of the rhetoric that can come from some of those the politicians in those states. So for a LGBTQ person to be elected and to represent Texas, like that is a big one that stood out to us. And then I don't know if you've heard of these people named like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Anya Presley, and Rashida Tlaib. They're just these randos in Congress who happen to be doing a really great job talking shit to corporations who are greedy and talking about billionaires not paying their fair share in taxes. All those folks were reelected this last cycle. So I wanted to share that too. And if there's anything I've forgotten, Jason, let me know. But we're right around the mark where if you want to share any calls to action that the council has or any last tidbits for people to follow up with.
well, I would just like to give my prediction that I think AOC has a very bright future, and I would like to see her run for the highest office. And the reason I say that is she won in a district where Trump also won, right?
Mhm.
It's not, we did see some more of it this election, but it's very uncommon to have a split ticket district like that.
Right.
So she speaks to people. She's huge, and not downplaying the rest of the names because they're all huge in their own respect. The council, again, we encourage folks to be involved. If you want to support our work, our website is sococc.org. I hope I said that right. And, again, you can go on, you can just make a one time donation, you can become a member. If you're a licensee, you can sign your business up, or individual, of course. Or if you want to volunteer, as we talked about earlier, we're always looking for folks to join our ranks. So
Perfect.
our focus this year again is going to be a little bit more on licensees. We want to help those efforts get through. The
Right.
reality is our industries are failing financially, and we have to provide some relief there if we want to see longevity for both industries. And we'll be working hard to defeat the THC cap. So aside from that, we will be behind the scenes or in whatever capacity in the springs. We'll be a little more active, trying to push them in the right direction. And we just hope that our experience and our success in the past can be of assistance as we move forward. So.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I appreciate that. Well said, Jason. And so this is where we can happily remind folks that episodes of Justice with Jax are recorded as a member of the Studio 809 Podcast Collective at the Nexus Community Co-working Space in downtown Colorado Springs. So remember to ask yourself 2 questions. Who's telling your story? And how are you being the change that you want to see in the world today? So this is with Justice with Jax, signing off.